China and the U.S. talk trade, and President Donald Trump loses a key figure at the White House. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. This week, China and the United States held major economic and trade talks. Representatives from the world's two largest economies sat down for the first China-U.S. comprehensive economic dialogue in Washington, and they discussed ways to move forward with their economic relationship. Meanwhile, U.S. President Trump has been making news on a whole range of issues, including criticism of his Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, during an interview with the New York Times. And today, Trump lost a key member of his staff with the resignation of the White House Press Secretary, Sean Spicer. We will get to that in a few minutes, but we begin with the China-U.S. trade talks. Joining us now from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He's a political analyst with China Radio International. With us from Florida is author and commentator Dan Perkins. And with us too is Sourabh Gupta. He is a senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. Welcome to all of you to the show. Qinduo, let me start with you. And let's start with these trade talks that have been taking place here in Washington, the China-U.S. Comprehensive Economic Dialogue. We've just had a round of talks here. What did you make of it? Was it a success?
Well, obviously there's no joint statement, cancellation of a press conference. That's a headline in the media. But look, if you take a look at this name of the dialogue, comprehensive. So I think, there are several reasons probably for the lack of substantial progress in this first round of dialogue. Firstly, you see early harvest, some of the areas that's easy done. You see already the two sides reached agreement on the resumption of beef import from the U.S. and rice and of course liquefied natural gas, etc. And secondly, they touch upon long-term and also strategic areas in terms of this bilateral trade relationship. So it's not like substantial individual specific issues in specific sectors. And also thirdly, I would say the Chinese side is likely they would save the gift for the upcoming Trump's visit to China later this year. I'm pretty sure there will be some concessions, some agreements between the two countries at that time.
Dan, as we've been saying, these two countries are the world's two biggest economies, have a very close trade relationship. But the one big issue that has concerned the United States is China's trade surplus with the U.S. Did this round of meetings address that issue? Was there progress, especially the Chinese proposal that America ease up on its export policy, on its reform its export policy so that high-tech technology from the U.S. can be exported to China?
Well, I think that's an important issue, the idea of how do we come together, these two major nations, in terms of trade. I think one of the things that was overlooked in this agreement is energy. Most people don't know that China is much like America was when Jimmy Carter was president, and we were importing 60 to 65% of our energy needs. China is importing 65% of its crude oil, and 40% of the coal that China needs was coming from Korea. And so I think as we find ways to import more energy to China, that will help to some degree shrink the deficit that we have between. But I think there are other issues. As you mentioned, technology is important, agriculture is important. There's a lot of things that China can get from the United States. We just have to figure out what is the most fairest way to get it there for the purposes of taxes and tariffs.
Right, Sourabh, as Dan points out, there has been progress on agriculture, the export of United States beef to China, import of processed poultry from China to the United States. As far as energy is concerned, there's been talk about Alaskan liquefied natural gas going to China. What did you make of the talks?
With regard to the current round of talks, I think that it's what happened is that they are now trying to recalibrate their talks and recalibrate their discussion to do this from a longer term perspective. The first part was about early harvest. It was about market access. It was about trying to cut down the trade deficit at the margins. Obviously, there's going to be a limit to how much of that deficit can be cut down. But the goal now is to restructure that discussion and make it beyond market access and bring in a lot of sectoral discussions as well as a lot of investment-related issues. And so, yes, the discussion is being loaded a little bit, but a lot of those discussions which happened in the previous administration under the bilateral investment treaty, and which is a very difficult conversation to have because there are far-reaching demands which are being made on the Chinese side, are gradually being mainstreamed into this conversation. And so from that perspective, we are seeing this conversation kind of fill itself out more holistically. Of course, at the same time, because of domestic politics and Trump's campaign promises on issues like steel and his approach generally on trade remedies and anti-dumping and enforcement issues, those issues are also coming to the fore. So we are having this slight contradiction between something positive in terms of an all-encompassing conversation in which they will now try to find out certain sectoral bargains they can make, and at the same time, politics is rearing its head and creeping itself right onto the dialogue table.
And talking about politics, I mean, will we see tariffs being imposed on Chinese imports, steel imports, for instance?
What I understand and what I sense is that the determination will be made that that foreign steel imports is a national security threat. Now, that is not going to pass muster at the WTO, but passing muster in the WTO is still 2 years away. Now, just because a determination is made and recommendation is made to the president, that doesn't mean the president has to take it. And what I see is he is going to have a tailored approach thereafter, where he just doesn't do broad brush tariffs, but he tries to go after certain segments of the steel market and against certain countries. And we have to see how far-reaching that is or how shallow that is. But my sense is that that is the direction in which matters are going.
Qinduo, what would China like to see come out of this dialogue? What are some of the key things that China wants from the United States?
Well, I think from the Chinese side, obviously, it's a long-term stable relationship, including the trade relationship between the two countries. And if you look at, of course, as the Vice Premier Wang Yang said, China is very much looking forward to the relaxation of some of the rules in the United States. He described that as outdated. Mostly the high-tech products export to China. That's a minimum in terms in the whole blanket of the U.S. export to China, the goods and services. So in his remarks, he described the import of high-tech products in China every year is about more than $200 billion. But the U.S., those products from the U.S. only represents a small percentage, like more than 8% last year. So this is very small. If the U.S. could do something with that, obviously that will help balance the trade. And also, from the Chinese point of view, the issue is if you look at the numbers are static. The trade imbalance, we talk about more than $300 billion with China. But the thing is, if you look at the ongoing the trend, let's say, U.S. export of goods and services in the past 10 years, from 2005 to 2016, it's about 10 years. So it has increased 114%. U.S. export of services to China in about a similar period has increased 400%, more than 400%. Right. So the trend is more and more U.S. exports to China. So long term, I think as China is shifting to consumption, service, and innovation-based economic growth model, I think long term the balance will be there.
Right, and Dan, if we look at it from the U.S. side, we've got this export of beef from the United States to China, and we've just heard that rice exports will be going through as well. Are you encouraged by this?
Absolutely. I think that what we've seen is an opportunity here, and both gentlemen have used the word long-term, which I think is very important. We can't make decisions here on trade for the next 90 days. We've got to make trade decisions for the next 90 years. And so I think that both sides are trying to figure out how do they assimilate all the various powers and strengths of both countries into an effective trade agreement that allows both countries to prosper and, as a result, bring down the trade balance.
Sourabh, you talked a moment ago about the bilateral investment treaty. Are these negotiations a good starting point for that?
Yes, they are a good starting point for that, but there needs to be successful outcomes, first of all, which there have been in the 100-day plan, action plan, but which needs to be continued and kind of embedded within the dialogue framework, because then those harder issues can also be tackled. Many of those bilateral investment treaty discussions relate to the services sector and U.S. commercial presence in China in many sectors. The U.S. already has a surplus in its bilateral trade with China in services. President Trump's main grievance has been on manufacturing-related jobs and on the trade deficit with China and with other Asian partners. And so the focus should be to see how China could be of assistance in that area, including investing in the United States, and trying to see how it could also be useful for Trump in terms of generating manufacturing-led employment in many of those Rust Belt states.
So that's a big political issue for the administration here, right?
It is a very big political issue, but China has shown itself very intelligently and amenable in these issues. For example, with the UK, when David Cameron was there initially, ties were not good. There was the Dalai Lama issue, et cetera, et cetera. But China kind of brought the topic to David Cameron and to George Osborne, the Treasury Secretary, like, we are in a position to help you in depressed areas like Manchester, in those Rust Belt areas, and we can make investment out there. And if you can have your own strategies out there, maybe there is scope again for domestic regeneration. And that same kind of strategy, that concept is usable also in this country, moving some of those production techniques and production capacity to the U.S. to fulfill President Trump's campaign promises, because at the end of the day, he is going to be held on that, and China would like to make itself useful on that front.
All right, Qinduo, as you said, there'll be more talks, more dialogues over the next few months and years, but there are also other issues that are important to these two countries: the missile and nuclear program of the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. China has been coming under pressure from the United States to get that resolved. But overall, how would you characterize the China-U.S. relationship?
Well, I think, from the Chinese side, they do see there's a high expectation, probably too high expectation from the U.S. side somehow. With easy policy, we suggest like some trade sanctions, China could fix this North Korean problem. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. It's not that simple, let's say. And North Korea is, let's say, they don't listen to Beijing. Even Beijing is, of course, not happy with the missile test and the ICBM test, latest. That's is a threat not only to the U.S., South Korea, Japan, but also a threat to China and other regional countries. So China made it clear the goal is the same at the U.S. side. There will be no nuclear weapons on the Korean peninsula. So that's the goal. Of course, the approach to achieve the goal is slightly different, but I think obviously the cooperation is absolutely necessary between the two countries to achieve that goal.
Okay, we are going to have to take a break right now. We need to say goodbye to Qinduo Xu. Thanks for joining us, Qinduo. When we come back, we will continue with our discussion. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.